we typically do with many, at least, truths about the future. Now, Molinists admit that we can have counterfactual power over, to use Tom's phrase, the past distribution of matter and energy. But I think most Molinists see no reason to think of such cases where we really do have that kind of power, as anything other than exceptions to the general rule that we lack that kind of power over the past. Okay, then very briefly with regard to Tom's third point, and here what I'm going to give is a very sketchy and patently insufficient comment on Molinism and the consequence argument. If what I've just said in response to Tom's second point is true, then I think the Molinist response to his third point is pretty obvious. In the case of a normal, typical free action queue, it's eminently reasonable for us to think that 1 and 2, and I'm referring now to the numbers in the numbers for the consequence argument that Tom gives on page 4 of his handout. So in a normal case, it's eminently reasonable for us to think that 1 and 2 are true, while 4 is false. And therefore, it's reasonable for us to think that 3 is false, and thus that determinism 2 is false. Note that to give this response is not to say that the consequence argument works as a proof or a demonstration of metaphysical incompatibilism. Now, even if, so in other words, if my response to the second of Tom's 3 points is correct, then I think the response to the third is sort of obvious. But even if I was too sanguine about the Molinists' reliance on our pre-philosophical intuitions here, I mean, even if the Molinist can't reasonably say that in typical cases we can safely assume that we lack counterfactual power over the past and over the laws of nature, isn't it at the very least reasonable for a Molinist to think that there are some instances, some cases, some P sub O and Q, such that 1 and 2 are true, but 4 is false? As long as there are some such cases, isn't that enough for the Molinist to agree that we have a good argument, even if it's not a proof or a demonstration, that determinism is true? Okay. I think much more needs to be said there, but that at least is the direction in which I think I'd be inclined to reply.
Okay. Thank you. All right. So at this point, welcome you to come. Is this working still? To come to the microphones, and those who have not had a chance to ask questions, we ask that they be allowed to go first. I should say I personally like Tom's view because it allows for the power of retroactive prayer. As you've gone through a particularly orange light and you see a cop there, may that cop not have seen me as I zipped through there, okay? So I really like the view for that reason alone. All right, let's start on the right.
This question is for Tom Flint. This doesn't affect the substance of your argument, but you suggest AN4 as a simpler version of AN3. And it's not clear to me that AN3 and AN4 really are the same. In particular, it seems to me that someone might hold that something was accidentally necessary in the sense of AN3, but not in the sense of AN4. Cuthbert's free choice will, in part, determine which possible world our universe instantiates. And so if someone did take an Occamist view that we can have causal power over the past, then if Cuthbert chose not to buy the iguana, then our universe would instantiate a possible world in which God had known that all the time. And so, anyway, it seems to me that such a person might hold that God's knowledge was not accidentally necessary in the sense of AN4 because Cuthbert does have control over it, but is accidentally necessary in the case of in AN3.
Yeah, that's an interesting point. I mean, I need to think about that some. I was, of course, presenting AN4 as a sort of very loose sort of presentation, AN3 as being one way in which one might try to specify it more carefully. There may be other ways in which we could specify it more carefully where your alchemist would agree that the two don't come apart. But I think it's a good point.
Excuse me, thanks. A comment and then a question. First of all, I think the counterexample is very easily avoided by just adding "for the first time" in there. He's either killed for the first time in 2010 or 2020, and you avoid the resurrection problem.
That's actually what I thought initially as well. I was talking about that some with Tom earlier this morning, and I'm not as convinced that that's going to work.
Oh, okay.
So, but that's very much a side issue here anyway.
Yeah, it is. My question, I guess, is this. I like Crisp's example at the end about how once we're committed to counterfactual power over the past, like our power kind of explodes, and we seem to have this power to completely, at least for all we know, to completely rewrite the past. But that seems to demonstrate, at least to some degree, something I've thought for a very long time, that Molinism seems to kind of look, to use one of those philosophically rigorous terms, silly a bit. Because if that's the kind of power we're talking about, a kind of power that I could in no way realistically exercise ever because I know the past is never going to be any different than it actually is, that's not the kind of power that it seems to me libertarians really have in mind when they talk about the power to do otherwise, right? And so it seems that it just doesn't, like, Molinism, it's like the example seems to show that Molinism itself doesn't really kind of solve the problem that it needs to solve because this power seems to be very trivial.
Yeah. Well, I mean, knowing that the history has been a certain way, you know that you won't exercise that power is what you know, presumably. I mean, it doesn't follow from that you couldn't have a power to do something, which is such that if you were to do it, what you know would not have been true, and therefore you wouldn't have known it, okay? So I'm not sure the position is quite as silly as you make it out to be. Yeah, now, I guess I do think that Molinism might become, somewhat less plausible, or at least I would find it somewhat less plausible if you had a Molinist who thought that we really did have extremely wide-ranging power over all of these things in the past. Plantinga, for example, gives the example of the person who can mow, and if he were to mow, God would have, for reasons of God's own, he would have seen to it that these ants never moved into the yard. We can tell stories like that and see how, it's imaginable that there are situations in which I might have power to do something such that if I were to have done it, the concrete arrangements of things in the world might have been different in the past. But I don't see any reason for the Molinist to give up on the normal sort of pre-philosophical intuition that most of us have, that typically, at least, we don't have power over the past of that sort. How one would argue for that or justify that intuition, I must admit I really don't know. I think most of us come to philosophy with it, and I think you have a more plausible kind of Molinism if you try to defend or hold on to that pre-philosophical intuition as much as you can. And I think to a very large extent, Molinists can.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks.
So this is kind of a big picture question. So one kind of thing you want to say here is that there's not a single notion of accidental necessity, and a corollary of that is that there's not a single version of the argument that needs to be refuted. And I think if you start off by focusing on the conclusion of the argument as one involving accidental necessity, that all that seems attractive, what you said. But I kind of think the bigger picture here is the real conclusion of the argument is that you're not free with respect to the relevant action. And so I wonder, I know you well enough to think that you do think there is such a thing as freedom or free action. That's a legitimate thing. And so then I wonder if sort of taking a page from Al, how he sort of says, let warrant be the gap filler between true belief and knowledge. Suppose he said, let something like having a choice about be the gap filler between performing an action and its being free. Right? And so now we've got this single notion of freedom, and so presumably then there's going to be a single notion of having a choice about it's that gap filler. It might be disjunctive, it might be a mess, but we've latched on to something. And then I wonder if we could then say, okay, let accidental necessity just be not having a choice with respect to, or instead, just run the argument just with choice or whatever. But I wonder if, since you want to say there is such a single thing as freedom, and that's really the conclusion of the argument, that you're not free, if that then kind of puts pressure on you